Hello, I'm Julie Lerman. Welcome back to Entity Framework Core Fundamentals. In this module, you'll learn how EF Core comprehends one-to-one relationships when you're mapping them and interacting with them. First, I'll give you some insight into how EF Core interprets one-to-one relationships in your model. Then I'll connect some existing classes, the book and cover, in a one-to-one relationship. We'll migrate the database and note that we have to pay attention to some pre-existing data in the database that's now involved in this relationship. Not only will we query across this new relationship, we can also now pull a full graph from author to book to cover to artist, so you'll get to explore many-level relationships. Then, of course, we'll need to insert, update, and delete data involved in the one-to-one. And as we do that, you'll learn about unique foreign key constraints and some behaviors you'll need to be aware of. So let's get started. Before we dig into the code, I want to be sure you understand how one-to-one relationships work with Entity Framework Core. First, let's consider our domain. Having created the book cover class, we still need to associate that with the book for which the cover is being designed. A book can only have one cover, and a cover can only be tied to a single book. That's how our business logic is defined. One book to one cover. It's a one-to-one relationship. Our classes already exist. We just need to make them aware of each other and of their new relationship. There's an interesting requirement in EF Core with regards to one-to-one relationships, and this might align with your business, but it might not. That rule is that in a one-to-one relationship, EF Core must always be able to identify a principal and a dependent. In other words, one end must be considered the parent and the other the child. For books and book covers, this could make sense. A book is the real focal point in our business. The cover is an attribute of the book. But in other domains, both ends might carry equal weight, or the importance of one over the other might be a matter of perspective. For example, if you work in a company's HR department, you might want to know what desk a person works at. And in that perspective, the employee is the focus and the desk is an attribute. But if you work in that same company's inventory department, the desk would be the focus of your work, and the employee assigned to the desk would be the dependent. So your team should have decisions like these made in advance. Mapping the one-to-one relationship is similar to mapping one-to-many, except you'll never have that list of dependents. You just have one dependent. And EF Core will recognize a few mappings by default. It's notable that back in the old days of Entity Framework, before EF Core, you always had to provide a mapping for one-to-one relationships. But with EF Core, it will make its best guess, but you have to provide good clues. And if it doesn't guess properly, then you have to go and apply some mappings. The most obvious setup for EF Core to correctly identify the one-to-one mapping and which entity is the principal and which is the dependent is to have navigation properties on both ends and a foreign key property in the dependent. But there are a few others that it will recognize by default. For example, if you have a navigation in the principal and a foreign key in the dependent, EF Core will recognize that. And it's possible also to have navigations on both ends without a foreign key property. And EF Core will recognize the relationship, but that foreign key is critical for it to be able to recognize which is the dependent. So if you don't want to have the foreign key in there, then you'll have to add a mapping to make sure that the context can differentiate between the principal and the dependent. I won't be demonstrating that, but the EF Core docs do show how to achieve that as well. So by now, hopefully you know where those docs are, but I will link to them at the end of this module. In my model, that means adding a cover property to the book class, a book property to the cover class, and a book ID to the cover class as well. It's a lot easier to create a one-to-one relationship between objects before there's any data in the database. In my scenario, where there already is dependent data, I have rows in the covers table, I'm going to have to be thoughtful about how I go about this. But I only have a handful of rows in that table. If you have a lot of existing data that's going to have to go through this change, you'll need to plan ahead and get someone familiar with database constraints. But since it's an important lesson, this is the path I've chosen. By default, the dependent end of a one-to-one relationship, in this case the cover, is always optional as far as EF Core is concerned. That means you can have a book that doesn't yet have a cover. Like you saw with a one-to-many, you can affect these conventions in the mappings. However, there's no way to apply that constraint in the model, or for that matter, in the database. They will only complain when you break the rule. So if you want to require that the book always has a cover defined, you'll need to apply business logic that ensures the rule is followed. Also, by default, you can't have a dependent without a principal, so you can't have a cover without a book. And again, your business logic is the best place to ensure those rules are met. The two ends of our one-to-one relationship already exist, so let's see what happens when we connect them. I've changed the book and cover classes to follow that simplest path for defining a one-to-one. Book now has a navigation property for its cover, and the cover class not only has a new navigation back to book, but because foreign keys are your friends, I've also added a foreign key property, Book ID. Checking in with the EF Core Power Tools visualizer, you can already see that EF Core recognizes the one-to-one relationship. Notice the notation between book and cover, and that the Book ID property in the cover entity is recognized as a foreign key. There are a few more important details that I'll let a migration help me explain. So I'll start by adding a new migration called Book Cover Relationship. The first item in there says to add a new column to the covers table called Book ID. It's non-nullable with its default value of 0. There's also logic here to make sure that the new non-nullable Book ID column is set to 0 for each of the known rows in the covers table. And it's doing that based on what's found in the data seeding code. This part of the migration is actually presenting a problem, and I'm going to come back to it after I explain the next section, which will help me explain why these statements are problematic. The rest of the code in the migration shows what that problem will be. Here we're defining an index on the new Book ID. Remember that EF Core by default will always create an index on a foreign key. But because this is a one-to-one relationship, this index is unique. That means that since there can only be one cover per book, no two covers can point to the same book. And therefore, they all have to have a unique value for the Book ID foreign key, and they can't all be 0. And neither can the Book IDs in these 3 rows be 0. So we have to go back to the seeding logic and make sure that each of the rows we're defining for the covers points to a specific book. But first, we need to get rid of the bad migration. Now, I'm going to do something you haven't seen yet with migrations, at least not in this course. You may have noticed that every time I've created a new migration, the last line in the PMC says, to undo this action, use remove-migration. You can use the remove migration command easily if you haven't yet applied that migration to the database. And it's an important command because in addition to deleting that migration file, it will fix up the snapshot, reverting it to what it looked like before you added the migration. So since I'm not happy with what this migration reflects, that's exactly what I'll do. I'm just going to roll it back. It runs some SQL to just check that the migration is not listed in the history file. When it's done, you see it says that it reverted the model snapshot, and if you look in the Solution Explorer, the book cover relationship migration is also gone. I've re-added the migration, and I'm just using the same name, book cover relationship. And now the migration code is applying the actual book ID values to the covers. And this last bit is adding a foreign key constraint between the cover's book ID and the book's book ID. And this also means that unless you have a book with ID 0, a new row in the cover table with the default value 0 will cause an error. There's one more bit of data to glean here. Just like the dependence of the one-to-many relationship, if the parent, a book, is deleted, then its dependent book cover will also be deleted. Interestingly, that means that with the way I've let conventions drive the database schema, if I delete an author, their books will be deleted. And when those books are deleted, their covers will be deleted. And if the covers are deleted, any relationships between those covers and artists will be deleted. The artist won't be deleted though, just the relationship. So what you're seeing here are all the default mappings for a one-to-one relationship. We're not totally out of the woods yet, though. There are also 2 covers in the database that we added in code. And when I run a migration, they'll default to 0. And when the migration tries to apply that unique index, it's going to be very unhappy. So it will unwind any work that it already did in trying to apply that migration and just tell you, you can't do it. I only have those 2 rows to fix up. This isn't the kind of change that's going to be so simple with production data. It's more likely that if you're making a change like this with pre-existing data, that you'll make that relationship optional and not required. And it's less likely to make this kind of a business decision after the fact. But we're focused here on learning the basics. And when you're building a one-to-one relationship, by default, it will be required. So I'll continue on the path with the required relationship, and I'll use migrations to fix up those 2 rows. And we already know which books these covers go to. The cover with ID 4 is for the book Wool with ID 7, and the cover with ID 5 happens to go with the book whose ID is also 5, The Never. Remember, we have edited a migration file before, which is easier to do, which is a bit easier to do if you haven't applied it to the database yet. And I know I'm making a change that won't have any side effects. And here's the migration file after I've added 2 new update data commands to change the book ID value for cover ID 4 and the book ID value for cover ID 5. Now, if I were to generate the SQL script for this, you'd see that migrations will perform these tasks in the right order. First creating the book ID column, then filling the new values, and then applying the unique index and foreign constraints. Those last 2 will succeed because the data is already in those book ID fields. So now I'll go ahead and update the database with this migration. And looking at the covers table, there's the new foreign key property and all of the correct book ID values already applied. Stepping back for a moment, I want to remind you that dealing with that existing data wasn't so bad with my little sample database. You really need to take changes that will have this type of impact into account when you're planning. And if you have a lot of data existing, then you'll likely want to change EF Core's defaults and consult with someone who understands databases in order to plan how to prepare.